Welcome back. Today we are going to let the music burn and talk about the BL03 II by BLON. So this is what it looks like up close and personal. So again, it looks very, very similar to the original. There's kind of a new coating on the shell and obviously a little different color. But what's slightly different is if you look and kind of squint, maybe we can get a better look at this. Let's see, kind of like this. So if you look at the base ring kind of right here, you'll see there's probably maybe a little bit of an extra millimeter here that doesn't exist on the purple one, which is the original. So yes, it's not exactly the same nozzle. They did add something to it, but does that significantly change how it fits or how difficult it is to find tips and get the right position and seal on your ear? No, it's pretty much the same exact fit problems that the original had. Same thing on the cable. The cable is obviously a much nicer cable than the original one, but does it make fitting it or anything like that any easier? No, it's just a nicer cable, and I tend to not like the tight ear hooks on this one as well. So all that being said, I will say that I was a huge fan of the original BL03, and like everyone else, I always wanted a better BL03. I didn't want a changed BL03, and I'll say coming at this like a fan of the original, I will say that they probably changed it more than I would have preferred. It's slightly a different set than the original one, and I am definitely of the mindset of I would have wanted the original character of the original one, just kind of a better version of that, and no one ever really defined what the better version of that one was. But to change it, I think went a little bit too far in the number 2, and we'll kind of talk about what really changed. And so if you didn't like the original one, you're probably a bigger fan of the second one. If you like the original one, I would probably stick with the original one, as the changes are, you can kind of see them right there on the graph. So where the original BL03 was kind of really bottom heavy, it had this lush, rich, thicker vocal midsection because this bottom half was a little heavy. The upper half was a little bit lower. They sort of tilted that balance and made this a little bit lighter and a little bit more brighter over here. So they shifted the balance from where it was kind of over here up here. And again, I would say from a feedback perspective of what people complained about the original, I do think that makes sense. I think if you were strictly looking at the people who didn't like the original and complained about the original and said, well, you should make it, a little bit cleaner in the base, a little bit tighter, you should make it a little bit brighter, not as dark. I do think that this change is a reflection on a lot of that feedback. But it's not necessarily the feedback of the people who love the set and said, well, I love the rich, thick vocals, very natural sounding vocals. Just refine them to make them a little bit, give them a little bit more clarity. I think that is a different story than what they actually did. And this is, I would just call this more of a response to the people who didn't like the original. And they said, well, since there was a bunch of people who didn't like the original, we're going to make some changes and try to get those people, as opposed to really catering to the people who loved the original and just wanted it a little better. So is it an upgrade from the original BL03? I think yes. If you heard the original and you complained about it was too much bass and too muddy and not enough treble and air, the new one really fixes those things and addresses those style of issues and complaints from the original. And no, like I just said, if BL03 heard the original and it was a memorable set to you, the new one is similar but not necessarily a better BL03. It's slightly different coming from the original. It's slightly different, as I said. If you come at this as I really love the original, it's kind of a different set. So is it a little bit, too little, too late? And I do think that there is a little bit of that to this set, right? It's 3 or 4 years later. And what was memorable about the original was at the time, there weren't that many nice single dynamic driver sets at the $30 range. There was a lot of V-shaped sets. V-shaped sets tend to hide, okay level dynamic drivers. It's kind of a way to make a fun sounding set without really having to worry about the quality dynamic driver. You just throw a lot of bass at it, there's a lot of treble at it, and people have a lot of fun, but they don't necessarily hear a lot of the details and resolution and things that you heard at pricier sets. So the original BL03, this sort of gave people a taste of what more expensive single dynamic drivers could sound like, bringing that sound down to a $30 price level. And that was what made this set actually special. It sounded like probably the first set that really sounded like a more expensive set. And it was tuned very well, and it had a dynamic driver that actually fit the tuning. It was a really nice set, and really strange at the time. It was very different from everything else that was coming out at the $30 price range. So it was very memorable. It sold millions of sets, and it rightfully was, at the time, very different, very shocking to hear, because nothing else was like it at the time. So 4 years later, is it a little bit, a little too little, too late? And I think, yes, I think the new one, it's a nice set, but it doesn't really have the magic of the original. The new tuning makes it sound a little bit more generic than the original BL03, right? It doesn't have the impact. There's no real wow factor, right? This is a tuning that we've heard over 3 years a lot, and dynamic driver is okay. You don't really have that, this doesn't sound like anything that exists today. It sounds very much like a lot of sets that exist today. But on the other hand, it's still a nice set. It still has a legendary story behind it. The price point, it's still $32, and that makes it, a very important set, because the prices of these sets have actually crept up a little bit in 2024. If you looked at what the average single dynamic driver was selling for, it actually went up compared to where it was. There aren't that many sets coming out at the $30 price range. They're kind of in that $40, $50, $60 range as opposed to the $30 range. So I do think it's important to still have sets coming out at that price range, so kind of give them credit for doing that at the same price point. On the sound, again, I would just call this a cleaned up and airier BL03. Slightly less bass, a little bit more upper range. You can kind of see exactly what they did here. They kind of took a little bit of the meat out of the bass shelf and then added a little bit more upper range, and those two changes kind of shifted the balance, or where the original BL03 was kind of lower, definitely lower centric. It had that thicker, heavier style sound to it, a more natural sound, because there was a lot of body behind it. And then they kind of got rid of all of that and shifted it kind of over here. So now it's a lighter weight, kind of an airier sound, kind of more, I guess you can call it a little bit of a brighter sound as well. On the bass, again, it still has kind of a heavy bass shelf. You can kind of see it there. They just ticked it down a little bit to sound slightly cleaner without losing the lower end character of the original. So again, they kind of took this down just a little bit, not all that much, but this combination of ticking it down a little bit here and increasing this, I think the two of them add up to kind of a bigger change than it actually appears on the graph. So on the mids, I guess this is kind of where the two changes kind of come together, and where I sort of disagree on changing it versus making the original better. I think the part that I didn't quite get here is the treble increases, lifts the mids slightly thinner. It takes on a very not BL03 sound. And again, I was coming from a fan perspective of what I really liked about the BL03 was sort of that body and thickness and naturalness to vocals. And if you complained about that, then this change makes perfect sense. If you really like that and you just wanted it to be slightly cleaner, that's not really what they did. They basically thinned it out and made it a little bit brighter and elevated it, as opposed to kind of refining what exactly was there in the original. So, it's kind of a mixed bag. It just depends on what your perspective was on what you heard on the original. So the treble, again, I think they could have used pretty much the same exact bass shelf. If they were going to make this change of just increasing the upper range just a hair, they probably could have kept the bass exactly the same, and it probably would have sounded slightly more like the original, I think. But doing both changes definitely changed the character of this set. And, I think they could have used the original. It definitely lifts the treble. It doesn't sound bright, but it sounds elevated. It definitely sounds airier. Again, it's kind of closer to other sets in character. And again, that's sort of the part that I didn't get about this set, is they took something that had maybe a unique sound to it. The BL03 had kind of a really nice sound that millions of people obviously liked. And then they made it sound much closer to what other Harman sets sound like today. And sure, there's kind of a heavier bass shelf there, but lifting this as much as they did, it definitely leans more closer to the Harman sets that we've had for 2 or 3 years, as opposed to something that was really enjoyable and my favorite part of the original. So yeah, so as I said in the first video, I think the this whole extra air out here wasn't really all that necessary. It was really a nice part of the original, the way the original rolled off in that way. It does add a slight artificial sound, which doesn't exist on the original. It thins out the body of the vocals. And again, it causes, this whole little bit out here causes a weird artificialness to the vocals that I wasn't a fan of. You know, everything that I liked about the original, they seemed to pick at and made changes to. And again, if you hated the original one, all these changes will make kind of sense to you. But if you love the original, you'll sort of question why they made all of these changes. They made it sound different from how the original sounded. So again, if you hated that darker sound to the original, this one is no longer dark. It's actually quite airy now. Perhaps a bit of an overcompensation out here. They added, again, these two changes add together to a bigger change as opposed to looking at them as two really small changes, and it's just like the original, just, you know, a slight difference. But I think the two added together, the sum of them is actually bigger than what you're seeing here. So that is what I got on the BL03. So do enjoy your weekend or enjoy your week, and let the music burn, and I will see you next time.